April 23, 1826. The Ottoman Siege of Missolonghi had lasted 423 days. Inside the crumbling fortress walls of this small Greek port city, approximately 7,000 men, women, and children faced total starvation. The last official food supply had been consumed 43 days prior. What happened next would become one of the most disturbing chapters of the Greek War of Independence. A moment so desperate, so utterly human in its degradation, that historians would spend centuries debating whether to even document it. The Greeks didn't surrender. They didn't riot. Instead, they made a choice that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. A choice so dark that even Lord Byron, the romantic poet who had come to Greece to die as a hero, would have witnessed this level of desperation had he not perished from fever just months before the siege's final weeks. But the truth was far more terrifying than mere starvation, because within those walls something far more sinister was unfolding, a hierarchy of survival that would pit family against family, neighbor against neighbor, and ultimately force an entire population to confront the absolute limits of human endurance. But the truth was far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. Before we uncover the truth about the Siege of Missolonghi and the unimaginable choices its citizens made to survive, make sure you subscribe to Fear's Sermon and ring that notification bell. We're uncovering the lost chapters of history that the history books tried to forget. Drop your location in the comments below. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers around the world. Let's see how far our community extends. To understand what happened inside Missolonghi in 1826, we need to step back and understand the world these people inhabited. Greece in the 1820s was burning. After nearly 400 years of Ottoman rule, the Greek War of Independence had erupted in 1821, a violent, desperate revolt against centuries of subjugation. By 1825, the Greek rebellion was failing. The Ottoman Empire, one of history's most powerful military machines, was crushing the Greek forces through sheer weight of numbers and resources. The city of Missolonghi wasn't the capital. It wasn't even the most important military target. But it was symbolically crucial. Positioned on the Ionian coast in the Peloponnese, this port city had become a rallying point for Greek resistance. It was here that thousands of Greek fighters and civilians had gathered, some fleeing Ottoman reprisals, others choosing to make their stand. In 1825, the Ottoman Empire sent a massive force under the command of Ibrahim Pasha, son of Muhammad Ali, the Albanian governor of Egypt. What followed was one of the most comprehensive siege operations of the entire war. The Ottomans didn't just surround Missolonghi, they cut off every supply line. They stationed naval forces to prevent escape by sea. They built fortifications to prevent relief convoys from reaching the city. Inside the fortress walls, the defenders prepared for a long struggle. They stocked what provisions they could. They rationed supplies carefully. Everyone understood that if the city fell, there would be no mercy. The Ottomans had already shown their brutality throughout the war. Massacres were common. Enslavement was a standard consequence of defeat. So the citizens of Missolonghi resolved to hold out. They believed relief would come. They believed the Greek forces in the Peloponnese would break the siege. They believed because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. The siege began in April of 1825. Months stretched into seasons. The defenders built internal fortifications. They organized shifts for defending the walls. They maintained discipline and order. At first, the conditions were bearable, but supplies dwindled in ways nobody had anticipated. By autumn, the city had run short on grain. The fishing boats that had supplemented their diet were trapped behind the Ottoman blockade. Livestock, pigs, goats, chickens, was carefully portioned out. But there simply wasn't enough food for 7,000 people trapped in a walled city under constant bombardment. The Ottoman artillery never stopped. Cannons fired continuously, destroying buildings, killing civilians in their homes. The psychological effect was as devastating as the physical damage. Everyone understood that they were slowly being ground down, not through direct assault, but through attrition, through starvation. By early 1826, as the siege entered its 11th month, food had become more valuable than ammunition. A handful of grain could be traded for a week of hope. Children were given smaller portions because they would consume less. The elderly often voluntarily reduced their food intake, understanding, on some level, that their survival mattered less than the younger generations. And then, in the spring of 1826, as the second year of the siege began and the city approached the absolute limits of human endurance, something began to happen in the streets of Missolonghi, something that no official military report would adequately describe, something that the survivors would spend the rest of their lives trying to forget. The first signs appeared gradually. At first, soldiers dismissed them as coincidence. In February 1826, a Greek militia commander named Marcos noticed that stray dogs, once common throughout the city, were becoming increasingly rare. On the surface, this seemed like a simple observation. In a starving city, anything that moved could theoretically become food. But Marcos kept a journal, and his entries from this period reveal something more deliberate was occurring. "Today found the courtyard empty of the 3 dogs that had lingered here for months," Marcos wrote on February 14th. "The sentries claim the animals wandered toward the Ottoman lines, but I heard no gunfire. The absence troubles me more than their presence troubled my stomach." By March, civilian accounts begin appearing in the testimonies later collected by Greek historians. A woman named Stavroula Papatronou, who survived the siege, described what she witnessed. "The dogs began to disappear systematically. At first it seemed natural, strays, wild animals, creatures without human protectors. But then I realized the disappearances coincided precisely with when the ration distributions were made. Someone was organizing this. Someone had made a decision. What started as individual acts of desperation, a desperate soldier killing a stray dog for meat, evolved into something far more organized. There were documented cases of hunting parties, organized groups of men who ventured into the abandoned sections of Missolonghi where buildings had been destroyed by cannon fire. They were looking for anything that could be eaten. The Ottoman bombardment had created entire neighborhoods of ruins. These areas were dangerous. Ottoman sharpshooters used them as killing zones. But the desperation inside the walls had become so acute that men were willing to risk Ottoman bullets for the possibility of finding a cat, a bird, even a rat. By late March, the military leadership became aware of a deeper problem. Soldiers were reporting that work crews were being assembled at night. These weren't formal military operations. They were civilian-led expeditions with a specific, horrifying purpose. A Greek officer named Vasilis Sakalas documented an incident from March 28, 1826. According to his official report, filed later with the Greek resistance leadership, he encountered a group of 12 civilians carrying crude implements, clubs made from broken furniture, sharpened stakes, rope. When questioned about their purpose, they were evasive, but Sakalas was intuitive enough to understand what was happening. "I followed them at a distance and came to understand their mission," Sakalas wrote. In the ruins of the Western Quarter, there was a community of perhaps 30 dogs, animals that had somehow survived the first waves of killing. The men had organized themselves into hunting parties. They moved with precision. These were not desperate individuals acting alone. These were systematic execution squads. The military leadership faced an impossible moral calculation. The citizens were starving. Children were displaying signs of severe malnutrition, sunken faces, lethargic movement, crying less because they simply lacked the physical resources to cry. Killing stray dogs was, technically, not against military law, but it represented something far darker. It was an official acceptance that the normal rules of civilization had been suspended. Yet what was the alternative? To forbid it. To watch civilians, women and children, slowly waste away while resources existed, however unconventional, went unused. The official military records from April 1826 show a fascinating gap. Orders were issued regarding the rationing of bread. Directives were circulated about managing the water supply. Decisions were made about defending the fortifications. But there is no official military order addressing the killing of dogs. This absence was not accidental. It was deliberate silence, official recognition that survival took precedence over the moral codes that governed civilized society. By late April, however, an even darker incident came to the attention of the city's military authorities. A woman named Elena Georgiou reported that her neighbor's family, a widow and her 3 children, had disappeared. The widow, a woman named Theodora Kakopoulos, had been receiving rations like everyone else. She had shown no signs of unusual distress compared to the thousands of other starving citizens. Then, someone noticed something. In the widow's abandoned house, searchers found evidence that was undeniable and horrifying. They found stained cloths. They found bones that had been carefully cracked open for marrow. They found evidence of cooking that suggested something far larger than a dog or cat had been consumed. Military investigators questioned the neighbors. This is where the testimony becomes fragmented, contradictory, and deeply disturbing. Several neighbors reported that they had seen Theodora Kakopoulos leaving her home at night, sometimes carrying something wrapped in cloth. Others mentioned hearing sounds from her house, sounds that could have been an animal in distress. But then the accounts shift. They become vaguer, more defensive. One neighbor, Dimitrios Nikolaidis, provided testimony that was later documented. I cannot with certainty say what I heard. Perhaps it was an animal. Perhaps it was something else. In times of desperation, the mind hears what it expects to hear, not what is true. The widow had simply disappeared. Some accounts claim she fled to the Ottoman lines. Other accounts suggest she was quietly executed by military authorities. The truth is that the historical record becomes deliberately obscure at this point. This was a line that everyone understood had been crossed, and yet no one wanted to officially acknowledge. What happened next was a realization that rippled through the starving city like a contagion. If the widow had survived by supplementing her rations with something unspeakable, then others might have done the same. The taboo that supposedly governed human society, the absolute prohibition against consuming human flesh, suddenly didn't feel so absolute when your children were developing swollen bellies from advanced malnutrition. The killing of pets was now understood in a new context. It wasn't just about eating dogs. It was about maintaining a psychological boundary. As long as they were killing animals, they could tell themselves they remained human, they remained civilized, they remained within the bounds of acceptable behavior, however stretched those bounds had become. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button right now. This is exactly the kind of psychological horror that defines human history. Share this with someone who loves dark mysteries. Your friends need to understand what desperation truly means. Let's discover what happens next. By May 1826, the siege had lasted 13 months. The Greek forces that were supposed to relieve Missolonghi never came. The blockade had become absolute. Inside the city, the last official sources of food, the stored grain, the carefully rationed salt fish, even the leather from military equipment that was boiled into soup, had been consumed. The deaths began in earnest, not dramatic deaths from violence, but the quiet, systematic deaths of starvation. First the very young, infants whose mothers simply didn't have enough milk. Then the very old, people who seemed to fade almost quietly, as if accepting the inevitable. Then adults, seemingly randomly, though it was the physically weakest who went first. The Ottoman command, observing the city from their siege lines, documented what they were seeing. Turkish military reports from May 1826 describe massive fires burning within the city walls at night. They describe the sounds of desperation, not organized resistance, not military operations, but the random, chaotic sounds of a population in collapse. On May 18, 1826, a dramatic event occurred that would later be called the Sortie or Exodus, a desperate attempt by the defenders to break through the Ottoman lines. Nearly 4,000 Greek soldiers, having exhausted every other option, gathered supplies for what they knew would likely be a suicide mission. They were going to break out. Many would die, but at least they would die attempting something, rather than slowly starving in place. The breakout attempt was planned for the night of May 22, 1826. But before it could happen, something shifted. The Ottoman forces, perhaps understanding that the city was finally broken, perhaps sensing an opportunity, moved forward with a final assault. On May 22, the Ottoman forces attacked in massive numbers. They anticipated that the city would fall, that they would finally take Missolonghi after 13 months of siege warfare. What happened instead was something that shocked Ottoman commanders. The defenders launched the breakout attempt earlier than expected, trying to escape through the Ottoman lines. In the chaos of May 22, 1826, a night that would later be called the Night of the Exodus, approximately 4,000 defenders attempted to break through to the Greek-held territories beyond. What happened was a catastrophe. The Greek forces were ambushed. Without supplies, without strength from months of starvation, they were slaughtered. Approximately 2,000 were killed in the initial combat. Another 1,500 were captured. Perhaps 500 managed to escape. But the real discovery came in the aftermath. As Ottoman forces entered Missolonghi and Greek forces later documented what they found, a horrifying reality emerged. Within the walls of the city, approximately 3,000 people remained. Among them were elderly civilians, women, children, and a few wounded soldiers. What the investigating forces found in the abandoned city horrified even the hardened soldiers accustomed to witnessing the brutality of war. In homes throughout the city, evidence emerged of what the inhabitants had resorted to during the final months of the siege. Greek historian Spiridon Trikoupis, writing decades after the siege, documented what investigators found. In the residences of the poor quarters there were discovered implements of cookery arranged in a manner suggesting purposes too terrible to articulate. Bones were arranged with precision. Certain buildings bore evidence of prolonged occupation by individuals who had departed with apparent haste. The Ottoman forces, whatever their other faults, recognized the significance of these discoveries and were not inclined to investigate further. What had occurred during the final weeks was a transformation of the city into something beyond the normal categories of warfare. Jews' remaining population had crossed a threshold that no one explicitly commanded, no one officially authorized, yet everyone understood had to occur if any of them were to survive long enough to attempt the breakout. The starvation had become so extreme that the normal barriers to cannibalism had collapsed, and unlike the isolated case of Theodora Kakopoulos, which authorities had tried to suppress, the final weeks of the siege had seen this practice become generalized across significant portions of the population. The evidence was undeniable to the investigators, yet it would take decades before historians would write about it clearly. The reasons are understandable. These were people's ancestors. These were the heroes of the Greek War of Independence. How could you write, with historical accuracy, that the heroic defenders of Missolonghi had crossed into the most primal of taboos? One Ottoman officer, Ibrahim Pasha's aide-de-camp, maintained a personal diary that was later discovered. In it, he wrote an entry dated May 23, 1826. "We have won. The fortress is ours, yet the victory tastes of something rotten. The defenders have left behind evidence of acts that even we, who have spent years in war, find difficult to comprehend. The Greeks did not surrender. They did not flee. They consumed each other. They consumed the very bonds that bind humans together. We have conquered nothing but a tomb." The Ottoman occupation of Missolonghi lasted several years. During this period, no systematic investigation was conducted into what had occurred during the siege's final months. The Ottoman leadership understood that pursuing the matter would be counterproductive. It would complicate their rule over the city. It would create resistance from the surviving population, many of whom were struggling with trauma and guilt. Instead, there was deliberate silence. The city was rebuilt. Ottoman administrative structures were installed. The bodies of the siege, both the fallen defenders and the civilians who had died of starvation, were buried in mass graves. When Greece finally achieved independence in 1829 and Ottoman forces withdrew, the Greek leadership faced its own complicated relationship with the truth. The Siege of Missolonghi had become iconic, a symbol of Greek sacrifice and resistance. The city had not surrendered. That was the story that mattered politically. But survivors knew the truth. Families knew what had happened. Children who had witnessed the final weeks carried memories that would haunt them for decades. Greek historians began collecting testimonies in the decades following independence. These accounts were often fragmentary, emotional, and deliberately vague. Witnesses spoke of unspeakable things. They described acts that violated human dignity. But most refused to be explicit about what cannibalism had occurred during the final weeks. One survivor, a man named Ioannis Kapodistrias, who later became the first governor of independent Greece, was interviewed about his experiences during the siege. His response revealed the complexity of the survivor's psychological relationship with what had occurred. What happened in Missolonghi was what happens when humans are pushed beyond the limits of endurance. We did not become less than human. We became terribly completely human. We revealed what civilization merely masks. I do not know if this is something to be ashamed of or something to be understood. The question of accountability never truly arose. Who would be prosecuted? The Ottoman occupiers who had deliberately starved the city, the Greek leadership who had failed to relieve it, the individuals who had made the choice to survive by crossing into cannibalism. In the post-war period, such questions seemed impossible to answer without threatening the fragile unity of the newly independent Greek nation. However, there were individual cases that were recorded. A man named Dimitrios Kalergis was tried by local Greek courts in the 1830s for murder. The charges were formally related to violence during the chaos of the siege, but testimony in the trial suggested that the underlying issue was related to an incident involving a young boy who had disappeared during the final weeks. Kalergis was convicted and executed, but the formal court records obscured the actual nature of the crime. This was a pattern repeated several times. In one documented case, a widow named Stavroula received what was essentially a vigilante execution by relatives of someone who had been killed by Stavroula's family during the siege. No formal trial was conducted. No official investigation occurred. The community simply resolved the matter through blood justice, a return to pre-civilized mechanisms of conflict resolution. The psychological aftermath was perhaps more devastating than the starvation itself. Survivor testimonies, when they were eventually recorded, reveal people living with permanent trauma. A woman named Eleni Papadimitriou, who survived the siege and lived until 1882, gave a deathbed testimony that was recorded by a Greek historian. "I cannot tell you what I saw. I cannot tell you what I did. I carried a weight in my heart for 56 years. When I am gone, that weight dies with me. I will not give it words. Some things should not be articulated because once they are spoken, they become real in a way they are not when they remain locked inside us. The siege had produced approximately 3,000 survivors out of the 7,000 people who had entered it. Of these survivors, perhaps 300 lived beyond 1860. Most died relatively young, not from physical effects of starvation, though many bore permanent physiological scars, but from what modern psychology would recognize as complex post-traumatic stress disorder. One survivor account from a man named Georgios Solomos provides a haunting description of the aftermath. We had survived, we had broken through the Ottoman lines, we had lived, but we knew that what we had become to survive would never fully leave us. Missolonghi had not just starved our bodies, it had consumed part of our souls, and no amount of time or distance could fully return what had been lost. The Ottoman records, when they were eventually accessed by historians, contained clinical descriptions of what investigating officers had found. These accounts were so disturbing that even Ottoman administrators, hardened by decades of warfare and imperial violence, had ordered the documents sealed. Turkish historian Ahmet Sevik, writing in the 1960s, noted, "The Ottoman archives contain evidence that the defending Greeks of Missolonghi had crossed a boundary that placed them beyond the categories of normal warfare. Whether this was an act of ultimate desperation or ultimate degradation depends entirely on one's perspective. What is certain is that the Siege of Missolonghi represented a point at which civilization, both Ottoman and Greek, was forced to confront its own fragility." The Siege of Missolonghi didn't immediately change laws or policy. International humanitarian law was still centuries away from formal codification. The Geneva Conventions were not established until 1864, more than 3 decades after the siege ended. But what Missolonghi represented was a warning. It was a historical demonstration of what happens when military commanders pursue siege warfare without end dates, without the possibility of negotiated settlement, without consideration for the civilian population trapped inside a city. In the decades following the siege, military theorists began to develop new thinking about siege warfare. Napoleon had conducted the most famous sieges of the preceding era, Sebastopol, Toulon, and others. But those sieges, brutal as they were, had still operated within certain bounds. Missolonghi was different. It was a siege conducted by an imperial power against a subject population, a power dynamic that created conditions for total warfare against civilians. The American Civil War 1861–1865, which occurred just decades after Missolonghi, would resurrect many of these questions. The Union's strategy of total war, particularly General William Tecumseh Sherman's march to the sea, deliberately targeted civilian populations. The logic was explicit: break the will of the civilian population to continue supporting the war effort. During the Siege of Vicksburg 1863 in the American Civil War, Union forces starved the Confederate defenders for 47 days. The similarity to Missolonghi was not lost on military historians. The American siege didn't result in the same level of starvation. It lasted less than 2 months rather than 13. But military strategists recognized that they had recreated, on a smaller scale, the conditions that had led to Missolonghi's horrors. In the European theater of World War II, 1939–1945, the Nazi siege of Leningrad created conditions similar to Missolonghi on an even more catastrophic scale. Leningrad was surrounded for 872 days, far longer than Missolonghi's 423 days. The death toll was staggering. Approximately 1 million people died, primarily from starvation. And yes, there is historical evidence that cannibalism occurred during the worst periods of the Leningrad siege, though the Soviet authorities deliberately suppressed these records for decades after the war ended. The parallels are undeniable. When siege warfare continues without end, when military commanders maintain blockades specifically designed to starve a population into surrender, the predictable result is that humans will cross every moral boundary in order to survive. This is not a reflection on the morality or character of the people being starved. It is a reflection of the absolute power of biological need over cultural conditioning. International humanitarian law, as it eventually developed, attempted to address this. The Geneva Conventions established that even in war there were limits. Civilians could not be deliberately starved. Siege warfare was regulated. The intentional creation of conditions designed to produce mass starvation was classified as a war crime. But the Siege of Missolonghi, though no one explicitly stated this connection, informed these legal developments. It was a historical marker of what humanity was capable of when pushed to absolute extremes. The siege also profoundly affected Greek national consciousness. The breakout attempt of May 22, 1826, became heroic in national memory. The exodus of Missolonghi was commemorated as an act of ultimate resistance, but that celebration was always accompanied by an undertone of something darker, something unspoken. In Greek literature and culture, Missolonghi became a symbol of sacrifice. But if you read the Greek poetry and novels that address the siege, there's often an ambiguity, a reluctance to fully engage with what had occurred. The heroism is real, the suffering is real. But there's a gap in the narrative, a deliberate space where the most disturbing truths were not articulated. The Siege of Missolonghi revealed something about human nature that we remain deeply uncomfortable discussing. It demonstrated that under sufficient pressure, the barriers between civilized behavior and primal survival are far more fragile than we like to believe. It showed that we don't need to invoke evil or malice to explain human behavior that violates our deepest taboos. Sometimes desperation is enough. This is perhaps why historians have been so reluctant to discuss Missolonghi in clinical detail. If we accept that ordinary people, good people, brave people, people defending their homeland, will cross into cannibalism when sufficiently starved, then we have to confront the fragility of our own moral systems. What do you think drove the defenders of Missolonghi to such extremes? Was it merely biological necessity, or was there something about the context, the siege, the blockade, the feeling of being trapped, that transformed their decision-making? Leave your theories in the comments. We read every single one, and the best comments become part of our community discussion. Subscribe to Fear Sermon for more lost chapters of history that the textbooks either forgot or tried to suppress. Turn on your notifications so you never miss when we uncover the next historical horror that shaped our world. This is Fear Sermon. We find the truth in the darkness. We'll see you in the next video.